Imagine losing someone you love. The grief is unbearable, but you find comfort in knowing their final wishes are honored. You hold an urn, believing the ashes inside are the last remains of your loved one. But what if I told you they weren't? What if instead their body had been left to rot in the woods? Or worse, this isn't just a nightmare. It actually happened. In 2002, authorities uncovered one of the most horrifying scandals in American history. Over 300 uncremated bodies were discovered in various states of decay at the Tri-State Crematory in Noble, Georgia. Families who thought they had received their loved ones' ashes learned the horrifying truth. Those urns were filled with powdered concrete, dirt, and even wood ash. The man behind this atrocity? Brent Marsh, the crematory's owner. But what makes this case truly disturbing is that no one really knows why he did it. Was it negligence, insanity, or something even darker? Tonight, we're diving into the chilling mystery of the Tri-State Crematory. In early 2002, a gas company worker was performing routine checks near the Tri-State Crematory in Georgia. It was an isolated property, surrounded by dense woods. The crematory had operated for decades, run by the Marsh family, who had built a solid reputation in the funeral industry. But that day, something felt off. The worker noticed a rotting stench in the air. At first, he assumed it was a dead animal, but as he moved closer to the property, he saw something lying on the ground. It wasn't an animal, it was a human body, and it wasn't alone. Scattered in the woods were dozens of decomposing corpses. Some were piled on top of each other, others lay exposed to the elements, their skin leathery from decay. The scene was something out of a horror movie. Panicked, he called the authorities. When investigators arrived, they weren't prepared for what they were about to find. As the search expanded, officers stumbled upon body after body, lying in the woods, stuffed inside old sheds, crammed into metal vaults. Some were still in caskets, while others were left on the floor like discarded trash. The number kept growing. 50 bodies, then 100, then 200. By the time they had finished searching the property, the total had risen to over 300 uncremated bodies. Some remains had been there for years. Others were relatively fresh. But the most horrifying part? The families of these victims had no idea. They had been given urns filled with fake ashes, a mixture of concrete, dirt, and burnt wood. Some had even spread these ashes over lakes, in gardens, and on graves, believing they were honoring their loved ones. When the news broke, it sent shockwaves through the country. Hundreds of grieving families came forward, desperate to know if their loved ones were among the abandoned corpses. DNA testing was needed to identify the remains, and some were never identified at all. But one question haunted everyone. Why? Brent Marsh, the crematory's owner, wasn't a criminal mastermind. He was just an average man in his 30s, someone who had inherited the business from his father. There were no known signs of mental illness, no record of financial trouble, no religious beliefs that conflicted with cremation. So why would he do this? When authorities questioned him, his answers were vague. He initially claimed that the cremation machine was broken, but that excuse fell apart when investigators found a fully functional cremation chamber on the property. Then he suggested that he had simply been overwhelmed by the volume of bodies. But that didn't make sense either. Funeral homes paid him to cremate bodies, and he had been accepting the money without doing the job. If he had financial problems, why not just shut down or ask for help? And why fake the ashes? If he was just lazy or overwhelmed, why go through the trouble of giving families fake remains? Even more unsettling, why were some of the bodies carefully preserved? Some were fully intact, seemingly placed in sheds as if someone intended to return to them later. Was he keeping them for some twisted reason? Despite the horror of what happened, there are still more questions than answers. One of the most chilling aspects of this case is that there's no clear motive. Some believe Brent Marsh was mentally disturbed, that he may have developed some form of hoarding disorder, but instead of collecting objects, he collected corpses. Others think he simply got away with it for too long and felt no remorse. He was being paid for services he never provided, and when he realized no one was checking, he just kept going. But the most terrifying theory? That he enjoyed it. There were rumors, unproven, but unsettling nonetheless, that he frequented the property at night, that he visited the bodies, that he kept them close as if they were still alive. It's a horrifying thought. Marsh was eventually arrested and charged with 787 counts of theft, abuse of a corpse, fraud, and deception. He was sentenced to 12 years in prison, but even after his conviction, he never explained why he did it. He simply refused to talk. And so, to this day, no one truly knows the reason behind the nightmare at Tri-State Crematory. Over 300 families were robbed of the chance to say a proper goodbye to their loved ones. Many never received real ashes. The horror of this case still lingers, an open wound for those who lost someone. But one question still remains. Was Brent Marsh just incompetent? Or was there something much darker hiding in his mind? What do you think? Was this just a case of negligence? Or was there something sinister behind his actions? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. And if you enjoy spine-chilling true horror stories like this one, make sure to subscribe and check out our next story, about a funeral home that was hiding something even worse. Because sometimes, the dead don't rest in peace. Most of us don't think twice about funeral homes. They're places of mourning, of closure, where we entrust the bodies of our loved ones for a dignified farewell. But what if I told you that some funeral homes don't honor that trust? What if, instead of respectfully handling the dead, they hid them, let them rot, stuffed them into boxes, forgotten in the dark? This isn't just a horror story. It actually happened. In 2018, authorities raided Cantrell Funeral Home in Detroit after receiving an anonymous tip about something horrifying happening inside. They expected to find minor violations, maybe mishandled paperwork, overdue payments. What they found was something far more disturbing. Hidden in the ceiling, stuffed into boxes and bags, were the decomposed remains of 11 infants. Some of them had been there for years, and that was just the beginning. As investigators dug deeper, they uncovered dozens more improperly stored bodies, left to decay in shocking conditions. The question is, why? Tonight, we dive into the nightmare that was the Cantrell Funeral Home scandal. It started with a single phone call. On October 12, 2018, authorities received a tip about something disturbing inside Cantrell Funeral Home. The building had already been shut down months earlier due to violations, but this tip was different. It wasn't about missing paperwork or unsanitary conditions. It was about hidden bodies. When authorities arrived, they were hit with a smell unlike anything they had encountered before. It seeped through the walls, clung to the air, a thick, rotting stench of death. They began searching the building, and it wasn't long before they found something truly sickening. Inside a false ceiling compartment, behind insulation and debris, were small boxes and garbage bags. At first, investigators weren't sure what they were looking at. But as they opened the containers, the truth became clear. Inside were the decomposed remains of 11 infants, bodies hidden, discarded, abandoned. Some were wrapped in cloth, others left inside shoeboxes like they were trash. Some of these babies had been there for years. But the nightmare didn't stop there. As investigators continued searching, they found even more bodies. Some were stacked on top of each other, wrapped in moldy blankets, stuffed inside unrefrigerated rooms. Some were placed inside broken coffins, half decayed, forgotten. The total number? More than 60 corpses. These were people who were supposed to be laid to rest, mothers, fathers, children, but instead their bodies were left to rot inside a funeral home meant to give them dignity. Why? That was the question haunting everyone. Cantrell Funeral Home had been operating for decades, once seen as a trusted name in Detroit. Families believed they were leaving their loved ones in capable hands. But behind closed doors, something had gone terribly wrong. Bodies were not embalmed properly. Some were left in body bags for weeks, stored in rooms with no refrigeration. Others were piled into corners, forgotten like old furniture. And the worst part? Families had no idea. Many had received empty urns, told their loved ones had been cremated when, in reality, their bodies were still rotting inside the funeral home. Authorities discovered half-buried caskets filled with water damage, the remains inside unrecognizable. Some had maggots crawling over them, the wood of the coffins warped from decay. It was as if the funeral home had become a house of the dead, where corpses were hoarded, ignored, and abandoned. The community was horrified. How could something like this happen? And more importantly, who was responsible? At the center of the scandal was Ray Cantrell II, the funeral home's owner. When investigators questioned him, his answers were strange, almost nonsensical. He claimed that the business was struggling financially, that he had trouble keeping up with the demand for funerals. But does that explain hiding infant bodies in a ceiling? Cantrell insisted that he wasn't a bad man, just overwhelmed. He blamed a lack of funds, mismanagement, and confusion. But that explanation didn't sit right with the authorities. Because here's the thing, funeral homes have regulations. If a body can't be handled properly, there are legal protocols to follow. There are hospitals, city departments, and state-run facilities that could have taken over. Yet Cantrell did nothing. He continued accepting payments from grieving families, assuring them their loved ones were being handled with care, all while stashing bodies in back rooms, letting them decay in filth. His lack of remorse was chilling. Was he simply incompetent? Or was there something far darker at play? Even after the discovery, some disturbing questions remained unanswered. For example, why were the infants hidden separately from the other bodies? What made them different? Some speculated that Cantrell had planned to dispose of them later, but never got the chance. Others believed he may have been involved in illegal body trade, selling corpses to medical schools, research labs, or even the black market. And then there was the strangest theory of all, that Cantrell had a morbid obsession with the dead. Why else keep bodies for years, letting them rot under his care? Why hide them in ceilings, behind walls, instead of disposing of them? Was this just negligence, or something more disturbing? In the end, Cantrell Funeral Home was shut down permanently, and its owner was never allowed to operate again. But shockingly, no serious prison sentence was handed down. The families of the victims were left with anger, grief, and no real closure. Losing a loved one is already painful. But trusting a funeral home only to find out your family member was never buried, never cremated, never honored, is a different kind of nightmare. The Cantrell Funeral Home case remains one of the most sickening betrayals of trust in modern history. But here's the scariest part. This wasn't the first time something like this happened, and it won't be the last. So tell me, was Cantrell simply negligent, or was he hiding something much darker? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. And if you want to hear about another disturbing funeral home case, check out our next story, where bodies were buried in mass graves without anyone's knowledge. Because sometimes the dead don't rest in peace.